By 10:30 the next morning, three bank accounts my son had been using as though they belonged to him all showed zero. Before noon, his financial power of attorney was revoked. By 1 o'clock, I was driving away from Columbus with one suitcase, my late wife's photograph, and no intention of telling anyone where I was going. My phone began ringing before I reached the interstate. "Dad, what did you do?" I listened to the voicemail, once set the phone face down, and kept driving. 12 hours earlier, I had been sitting at my own kitchen table when my son told me I no longer belonged in my own home. "Dad, it's time for you to move into a nursing home," Eric said. "Natalie doesn't want you here anymore." He did not look ashamed. Natalie sat beside him. Behind her hung the clock my wife Mary had chosen when we bought the house 32 years earlier. Mary had been gone for 3 years, but I could almost hear what she would have said. "Don't answer while you're angry, Tom." So I didn't. Eric slid a glossy brochure across the table. A yellow note was attached to the front. "Deposit due Saturday. Someone can pick you up that morning," he said. "You should pack only what you really need." I looked from my son to my daughter-in-law. Neither asked whether I wanted to go. Neither mentioned that my doctor had never suggested I needed care. They spoke as if the decision had already been made, and my only remaining duty was to cooperate. "Fine," I replied. Eric's shoulders relaxed. Natalie gave a small nod as though I had finally become reasonable. That night I packed one suitcase. I added Mary's framed photograph, 2 changes of clothes, my medications, and the leather folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside were 18 months of bank statements, the deed to the house, and the power of attorney document I had signed when Eric's business failed. He believed age had made me careless. In truth, I had spent weeks documenting exactly how careless I had been with him. At 9 the next morning, I sat across from Linda Pierce, the bank manager who had handled the sale of my plumbing supply company. She traced every deposit and confirmed what I already knew. The money in all 3 joint accounts had come from me. I transferred only my funds, nothing Eric had earned, into a protected account at another bank. Then I removed his access and closed the joint accounts. My next stop was Claire Morgan's law office. I revoked Eric's financial authority, named an independent fiduciary, froze my credit, and signed instructions, preventing anyone from using my age as an excuse to control me again. At home, I left one sentence on the kitchen table. "You wanted me gone. I have honored your request." Then I drove south toward my friend Samuel's cabin in Hocking Hills. Eric's first voicemail was angry. By the 7th, his voice had changed. "Dad," he whispered, "please call me." I turned off the phone. He thought losing the money was the disaster. He still had not realized it was only the first thing I had taken back. As the Columbus skyline disappeared behind me, I kept thinking about how quietly it had all begun. Eric had not walked into my house one day and demanded my money. He had arrived carrying cardboard boxes, an embarrassed smile, and a promise that his family would be gone in 6 months. That was 18 months earlier. His home renovation business had collapsed after 2 large customers failed to pay. At least that was the explanation he gave me. He and Natalie had fallen behind on their mortgage, and their lender was preparing to foreclose. "Just until we get steady again," Eric said. "Grace shouldn't have to change schools." I was 70, recently widowed, and still learning how loud an empty house could be. Having my 16-year-old granddaughter under my roof sounded less like a burden than a blessing. So I opened the door. I also opened 3 joint bank accounts. One was for household expenses, one for emergencies, and one was meant to help Eric start another business after he found regular work. Every dollar came from the sale of Caldwell Plumbing Supply, the company Mary and I had built over 38 years. The arrangement was simple. Eric would deposit part of his paycheck help with groceries and utilities and save until his family could afford a place of their own. For the first few months, he thanked me often. He mowed the lawn, fixed a leaking gutter, and brought home my favorite barbecue on Sundays. Grace sat with me on the porch and asked stories about her grandmother. Then 6 months passed. Eric still had not found what he called the right position. He withdrew money from the household account for a new SUV, explaining that his old car looked unprofessional. Natalie hired contractors to replace my perfectly good kitchen because the cabinets were hurting the value of the house. I reminded her that I was not planning to sell. She smiled and said, "Not yet." Soon Mary's dishes disappeared from the dining room cabinet. Her sewing basket, recipe books, and framed photographs were packed into boxes in the basement. Natalie said she was reducing clutter. Eric replaced my truck without asking me, claiming the newer one was safer for someone my age. Little by little, helping them stop feeling like generosity and started feeling like surrender. They began calling the place our house. Natalie asked me to tell her before inviting my old friend Samuel over. If I questioned a purchase, Eric would sigh and say, "Dad, you probably forgot we discussed this." We never had. Grace noticed more than her parents realized. Once after Natalie criticized me for buying steaks, Grace whispered, "Grandpa, isn't it your money?" I told her not to worry, but I began keeping every receipt and downloading every bank statement. One afternoon, I went to print an insurance form and found an assisted living brochure in the tray. Across its cover, someone had written in blue ink, "Deposit due Saturday." Underneath it was a realtor's estimate for my house. They had not begun planning my future. They had begun planning theirs without me in it. I folded the realtor's estimate and slipped it inside the assisted living brochure. If I confronted Eric immediately, he would deny everything, and Natalie would say I had misunderstood. So I returned the papers to the printer tray exactly as I had found them. Then I started paying attention. The next morning, I searched my email and found a message from a local title company. Eric had contacted them using the financial power of attorney I had given him after his business failed. He had asked what documents would be required if my house were sold while I was transitioning into long-term care. No contract had been signed, and the house was still entirely mine. But Eric had presented himself as the man handling my affairs. 2 nights later, I heard voices through the kitchen wall. "If we sell quickly, we can clear the cards and still have enough for the new company," Natalie said. Eric lowered his voice. "Dad won't need a 3-bedroom house once he's in a facility." I stood in the hallway with one hand against the wall. They were discussing the home where Mary and I had raised Eric as if I were already dead. The following morning, I made an appointment with Dr. Harris, my physician of 14 years. He checked my medications, balanced memory, and ability to handle ordinary decisions. "Tom, are you having trouble cooking, driving, paying bills, or caring for yourself?" he asked. "No." "Has anyone told you that you need nursing care?" "My son is about to." Dr. Harris looked at me for a long moment. Then he documented that I was physically independent, mentally competent, and showed no medical reason for placement in a nursing facility. I carried that letter to Claire Morgan, an elder law attorney Samuel had recommended. She reviewed the power of attorney document and frowned. "This gives Eric broad financial authority," she said. "It does not give him ownership of your property, and it does not allow him to force a competent adult into a nursing home. But leaving it in place would be dangerous." Claire advised me not to act until I had copied the bank records, saved the emails, and documented the source of every dollar in the joint accounts. "Once you move," she warned, "your son may claim you agreed to the plan. Protect the facts before he rewrites them." For the next 2 weeks, I quietly assembled everything. Then Eric and Natalie sat me down at the kitchen table and delivered the ultimatum I had been expecting. Before answering, I gave my son one final opportunity. "Did Dr. Harris tell you I couldn't live alone?" Eric looked away. "This isn't just about what your doctor says. It's about what's best for everyone." Natalie folded her arms. "We need a life of our own. In my house, with my savings paying for it." That was when I understood there was nothing left to debate. "Fine," I said. They went to bed believing I had surrendered. I returned to my study, opened my calendar, and confirmed 3 appointments for 9 o'clock the next morning. At 8:45 the next morning, I parked outside First Franklin Bank with the leather folder on the passenger seat. I felt no triumph. I felt the cold clarity that comes when a man realizes waiting one more day could cost him his independence. Linda Pierce met me in a private office. I showed her the statements, the documents from the sale of Caldwell Plumbing Supply, and records tracing every deposit into the 3 joint accounts. After reviewing them, she removed her glasses. "Tom, because Eric is a joint owner, he could legally withdraw these funds too. If that is what you intend to prevent, we need to act now." That sentence settled the last of my doubts. The total was $218,436. I moved only the money I had deposited. I left untouched the small amount Eric could prove had come from his wages. Linda transferred my funds to a protected account at another institution, removed Eric's online access, and closed the 3 joint accounts. At 10:17, his debit card stopped working. I knew the exact time because my phone rang before I had left the parking lot. I did not answer. For years, I had answered every call from Eric, usually with a checkbook nearby. That morning, letting the phone ring felt like the first honest answer I had given him in a very long time. My second appointment was with Claire. In her conference room, I signed the formal revocation of Eric's power of attorney and named a licensed professional fiduciary in his place. I updated my healthcare directive so no one could claim authority over my care simply because he shared my last name. Claire also helped me freeze my credit, redirect my mail, change my banking passwords, and place the deed, Dr. Harris's letter, and my original records in a safe deposit box. We began moving my major assets into a revocable living trust that I alone controlled. "What about the house?" I asked. "You own it," she said. "But Eric and Natalie have established residence there. We will give them proper written notice. Do not change the locks or remove their belongings." I nodded. I wanted my home back, but I would not give Eric a legitimate reason to call me reckless. Just before noon, I returned long enough to collect my suitcase. On the kitchen table, I left a note. "You wanted me gone. I have honored your request. What you confused with your money has returned to its owner." Then I drove toward Samuel's cabin in Hocking Hills. By the time I arrived, Eric had left 11 messages. The early ones were furious. He shouted that a deposit for his new contracting company had failed and accused me of ruining his future. In the last message, his anger had become something colder. "If you don't call us, I'm reporting you missing," he said. "I'll tell the police you're confused and shouldn't be alone." I replayed that message twice. Eric had failed to take my money quietly. Now he intended to use my age to take away my voice. Samuel was pouring coffee when I turned my phone back on the next morning. Before I could call Claire, an unfamiliar Columbus number appeared on the screen. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Detective Alvarez with the Columbus Division of Police. Your son reported you missing and possibly impaired." "I am neither missing nor impaired," I said. "I left voluntarily because my son tried to place me in a nursing facility and gain control of my property." The detective remained polite but cautious. I gave him Claire's number and agreed to speak with a local sheriff's deputy. An hour later, the deputy sat across from me at Samuel's table. I showed him my driver's license, Dr. Harris's letter, and the documents confirming that Claire represented me. He asked where I was, whether anyone had taken me there, and whether I understood what had happened to my accounts. I answered every question clearly. "You have the right to travel without your son's permission," he finally said. "I'll report that you're safe." By noon, the missing person case was closed. Claire moved just as quickly. She sent Eric formal notice that his financial authority had been revoked and that I remained the sole owner of the house. She also instructed him and Natalie not to sell borrow against damage or substantially alter the property. A separate notice gave them the legally required time to move out. Eric called her office repeatedly. Without my money, the deposit for his proposed contracting company had bounced. His credit cards were nearly maxed out. 2 car payments were overdue, and Grace's private school tuition had not been paid. For the first time, their expensive life had to stand on their own income. That afternoon, I found a voicemail from Grace. "Grandpa, Mom said you got confused and ran away. Dad says you're sick. Please tell me where you are." Her voice broke on the last sentence. I called her while she was walking home from school. I told her I was safe, healthy, and staying with a friend. I did not describe the bank accounts or repeat the things her parents had said. "Did you want to go to that nursing home?" she asked. "No, sweetheart." "Then why did they say you did?" I paused. "That is a question your parents need to answer. But remember, this getting older does not mean surrendering the right to make your own decisions." She began to cry, and I hated Eric for placing her in the middle. Still, I refused to turn my granddaughter into a weapon. The next morning, Claire called with worse news. Her investigator had found an unfinished loan application among documents Eric submitted to a lender. It listed my house as collateral and included a copy of the power of attorney I had given him. The application had never been signed or approved, but the purpose was clear. Eric had been preparing to borrow against my home to rescue his business plan. "If he submitted false information or used your identity, we can refer this for investigation," Claire said. "Do you want to pursue it?" I stared at Mary's photograph beside my bed. Protecting myself was no longer the question. The question was whether doing so required me to destroy my son. For 2 days, I told myself that reporting Eric would be justice, not revenge. He had tried to use my home as collateral and my age as evidence against me. If a stranger had done those things, I would not have hesitated. But Eric was not a stranger. He was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway, the teenager who had worked summers in my warehouse, and the man I had rescued so many times that he had stopped believing consequences applied to him. That realization was harder to face than his betrayal. When Eric overspent in college, I paid the credit card. When his first marriage ended, I covered the attorney. When his renovation company struggled, I blamed customers, the economy, and bad luck, anything except my son's habit of making promises with someone else's money. I had called it helping. In truth, I had trained him to expect rescue. I called Claire. I don't want criminal charges unless he tries to use my name or property again, I said. But I won't restore the accounts and they still have to leave the house. That is a boundary, she replied, not a pardon. We documented the loan application and sent Eric written notice that any further attempt to use my identity would be referred to law enforcement. Then I completed the living trust. Grace's future inheritance would be managed by an independent trustee. Eric would never again control my finances, even if we eventually repaired our relationship. I expected that decision to satisfy me. It did not. The silence at Samuel's cabin gave me too much time to remember Mary. She had once warned me that every check I wrote for Eric postponed the day he would learn to stand on his own. I had accused her of being too hard on him. Now I understood she had been trying to protect both of us. A few days later, Samuel drove me to an active adult community near Lancaster. I toured a small cottage with a front porch, a woodworking room, and neighbors close enough to notice if someone needed help. No one took my keys. No one told me what I could pack. For the first time, I saw the difference clearly. Choosing less responsibility was freedom. Being pushed aside for someone else's convenience was not. Meanwhile, Eric and Natalie began cutting expenses and selling designer furniture and exercise equipment they rarely used. Grace told me her parents argued late at night. I reminded her again that repairing their problems was not her responsibility. Then Claire called. Eric wants to meet at my office, she said. He says he'll come alone, and he says he won't ask for money. My first answer was no. Claire waited before speaking. A boundary protects you, Tom. It doesn't have to become a wall forever. I looked at Mary's photograph and wondered whether refusing to listen would make me strong or simply lonely. All right, I said, one meeting. When I packed my folder, I placed the nursing home brochure on top. Beneath it, I put the unfinished loan application. If Eric wanted a road back into my life, he would first have to look directly at the road he had tried to send me down. When I entered Claire's conference room, Eric was already seated at the far end of the table. His shirt was wrinkled, dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and for once, there was no polished speech waiting for me. I placed my leather folder on the table but remained standing. You said you wouldn't ask for money. I won't, he replied. I sat across from him. Claire took the chair between us, though neither of us looked at her. Eric rubbed his hands together. Dad, what happened was wrong. Natalie was under a lot of pressure, and she became convinced that selling the house was our only. I raised one hand. Your wife did not tell me I had to enter a nursing home. You did. His mouth closed. If you came here to place your choices on Natalie's shoulders, this meeting is over. For several seconds, Eric stared at the tabletop. Then he nodded. You're right, he said quietly. I said it. I agreed to all of it. The truth came slowly after that. Eric had lost his job 6 months earlier. He had hidden it from Natalie, at first leaving the house every morning as if he were going to work. By the time she discovered the truth, they had already used credit cards to maintain their lifestyle. Between car loans, tuition, business debts, and ordinary expenses, they owed nearly $70,000. The new contracting company was supposed to save them. Eric planned to use the account I had funded as startup capital. If that failed, he intended to borrow against my house. I kept telling myself you would need care eventually, he said. I made it sound practical in my own head. You mean you wanted my assets before I was finished living? He flinched but did not argue. I opened the folder and placed Dr. Harris's competency letter in front of him. Then came the realtor's estimate, the nursing home brochure, and finally the loan application listing my home as collateral. Eric looked at each document as though he had never seen them together before. When did I stop being your father, I asked, and become your financial plan? His eyes filled, but he had no answer. I'm sorry, he finally whispered. Then he asked if I could restore enough money to keep Grace in her school. No, I said. I will make sure Grace is protected, but I will not use her as an excuse to rescue you again. His expression hardened for a moment. You know changing schools will hurt her. I stood and reached for my folder. That sentence is exactly why I cannot trust you yet. You are still turning your responsibility into mine. I had almost reached the door when Eric spoke again. I didn't come here to get the accounts back. I turned. He wiped his face with both hands. Grace asked me what kind of man throws his own father away. I couldn't answer her. The anger left his voice. What remained was shame. I don't know how to fix this, he said, but I know another check won't fix it. I returned to my chair. For the first time since he had ordered me out of my home, my son and I stopped discussing what he wanted from me. We began discussing what accountability would require from him. I did not forgive Eric in that conference room. Forgiveness was too large a word for one honest conversation. What I offered him was a path forward, and I made certain he understood that the path did not lead back to my bank accounts. I opened a legal pad and read the conditions Claire and I had prepared. "You and Natalie will leave my house by the date in the notice," I said. "You will not ask for an extension. Both of you will attend financial counseling, and you will create a written plan for your debts." Eric nodded without interrupting. "You will find steady employment before attempting another business. You will repay the personal expenses charged to our joint accounts, even if it takes years. Neither of you will ever have access to my banking mail medical records or legal documents again." "I understand. And Natalie must speak to me herself. I will not accept an apology carried through you." 2 days later, Natalie joined us in the same office. She looked composed when she entered, but her hands trembled as she placed them on the table. "I treated your home as though it were already ours," she said. "I treated your savings like an inheritance we were entitled to receive early. Debt made me afraid, but it did not make me do that. I chose it." It was the first apology either of them had given me without attaching an explanation meant to reduce their blame. I accepted the apology, but I did not pretend trust had returned. Then I admitted something of my own. "For years I confused rescuing Eric with loving him," I said. "Every time I removed a consequence, I taught him that someone else would pay for his choices. I helped build the problem that nearly cost me my home." Eric lowered his eyes. "That part belongs to me," I continued. "But what you did with that expectation belongs to both of you." They moved out before the deadline and rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Eric sold the SUV and accepted a sales position with a building supply company. Natalie returned to full-time work at a dental office. They entered financial counseling together, though Grace later told me their marriage remained strained. I did not move back into the ranch house. Too much had changed there, and I no longer wanted to maintain 3 bedrooms and a large yard. Several months later, I sold it through my realtor with Claire reviewing every document and moved into the cottage I had toured near Lancaster. The decision was mine. So was the timing. So was every dollar from the sale. At our next meeting, Eric handed me the first page of his repayment plan. "I don't want another check," he said. "I want a chance to become your son again." I studied his face. He sounded sincere, but sincerity had never been his greatest problem. Consistency was. "Then show me," I said. "Don't promise me." I had taken criminal charges off the table and left the door to reconciliation unlocked. But Eric would have to walk toward it himself, one responsible choice at a time. The punishment was over. The rebuilding had only begun. Over the next 9 months, Eric did not ask me to forgive him. He simply began doing the things he should have done years earlier. He used the proceeds from the SUV sale to pay down the credit card with the highest interest rate. He followed the budget created by his financial counselor and sent me a small payment on the first of every month for the personal expenses he had charged to our joint accounts. Some payments were only $200, but not one arrived late. I kept every check. Not because I doubted the bank would honor it, but because each one represented something more valuable than the amount written in the corner. For once, my son was accepting that a debt did not disappear simply because paying it was uncomfortable. Natalie returned Mary's belongings herself. She carried the boxes into my cottage and placed them carefully beside the dining table. "I should never have treated these like clutter," she said. Inside were Mary's recipe books, her sewing basket, our wedding album, and the chipped blue bowl she had used every Sunday for biscuits. Nothing in those boxes was worth much money. That was precisely why their return mattered. Natalie was beginning to understand that value and price were not the same thing. I thanked her, but I did not invite her to stay for coffee. Trust was returning in inches, and I had learned not to pretend an inch was a mile. Eric and I began meeting for breakfast once a month at a diner halfway between Columbus and Lancaster. We talked about his job, Grace's school baseball, and sometimes Mary. We did not discuss my estate. He never asked how much I had received for the house or whether I had changed my will. In October, I had cataract surgery. I could have asked Samuel to drive me, but Eric offered, and I decided to let him. He arrived 10 minutes early, drove carefully, and followed every instruction the nurse gave him. At my cottage, he carried my medication inside, made sure I had water, and stopped at the doorway. "Do you need anything else?" he asked. "No, son. I'm all right." He nodded and left without inspecting the rooms, opening my mail, or behaving as though helping me gave him authority over me. That quiet respect moved me more than any apology had. At Thanksgiving, I invited Eric, Natalie, and Grace to my cottage. Eric brought the turkey and paid for it himself. Natalie made Mary's biscuit recipe in the chipped blue bowl. Grace laughed when the first batch came out too hard, and for a few hours, the family sounded like a family again. Before leaving, Eric handed me an updated repayment statement. He had reduced their debt, kept his job, and made every payment he had promised. I looked at the paper, then at the man standing before me. He was no longer acting like an heir waiting for his turn. He was learning late, but honestly, to become an adult. "I'm glad you came, son," I said. His eyes lowered for a moment. "I'm glad you gave me a road back." I did not tell him the road was finished, but for the first time I believed he would keep walking it. 1 year after the morning I emptied those accounts, I turned 71. Eric, Natalie, and Grace joined Samuel and several of my old friends for dinner at a small restaurant near my cottage. There were no speeches about forgiveness and no dramatic promises. Grace brought a chocolate cake, Natalie brought Mary's blue bowl filled with biscuits, and Eric spent most of the evening listening to stories he had heard a dozen times before. When the check arrived, I reached for it out of habit. Eric placed his hand over the folder. "I've got it, Dad. I can still afford my own birthday dinner," I said. He smiled. "I know. Your money is yours. Spend it on your life." A year earlier, my son had looked at my savings and seen a solution to his problems. Now he was telling me to use those savings for myself. It was a small sentence, but it showed me how far he had come. I let him pay. That did not mean I returned his access to my accounts. He was not restored as my power of attorney, and my home, savings, and healthcare decisions remained protected by the arrangements Claire had created. Grace's future inheritance was still held in an independently managed trust. Reconciliation did not require me to hand back the keys to someone who had once misused them. In fact, those boundaries were what allowed affection to return without fear hiding beneath it. I also learned lessons I wish I had understood sooner. Retirement savings should not be placed in joint accounts merely for convenience. A power of attorney should be reviewed while you are healthy, not during a crisis. Important medical, financial, and property records should remain secure and independent. And no older person should sign away a home or accept unwanted care because relatives insist that age has erased the right to choose. There may come a day when I need more help. If it does, I hope I will have the wisdom to accept it. But accepting help by choice is very different from being removed for someone else's convenience. Emptying the accounts gave me immediate satisfaction, but revenge did not repair my family. Healing began when Eric accepted consequences and when I stopped protecting him from adulthood. I had to learn that love without boundaries becomes dependence. Eric had to learn that an inheritance is not money owed to the living by someone who is still alive. As we left the restaurant, Eric walked beside me without taking my arm or treating me as fragile. "I'm glad you came back, Dad," he said. "I didn't disappear because I was confused," I told him. "I disappeared because you had stopped seeing me. I came back when you remembered I was still your father and still the owner of my own life." If this story reminds you of a boundary you need to protect or a relationship that may still have a road back, take a moment to reflect on it. Share your experience in the comments if you feel comfortable, and subscribe for more stories about dignity, accountability, and second chances. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is say no and leave the door open for real change.